Alrighty, good day everybody, all the QGIS enthusiasts and everyone who's joined us for the open day today. It's going to be a short and sweet open day, but really fascinating. And our main theme of this open day is looking at the QGIS modeler and the model, what used to be the model builder. And with me today is Charles, or Charlie, who's going to take us through the QGIS Graphical Modeler, just give us a really great whirlwind tour, explain a couple of things, and show sort of the whole open source ecosystem. So sit back and relax. If you have any questions, throw them into the live chat, and I will pose them to Charlie as we go. And please enjoy. Over to you, Charles.
Righty. Hello, everyone. I am Charlie. For those of you who I'm not familiar with my work. I work with Cartoza as a GIS specialist. Probably seen me knocking about the mailing forums and the Open Day Telegram group, helping out where I can. And today we're just going to go through the QGIS Graphical Modeler, what it is, how to use it, and how to source and utilize resources from the community and the surrounding ecosystem. Kind of get some ideas on best practices for sharing models and obtaining models, and kind of leveraging the open source ecosystem to produce your best work in the most efficient manner possible. So when I find my mouse cursor, I'll start sharing my screen. Alrighty. So just to start off, Amy, can you just confirm that?
Yep.
You can spy on me. Okay, great.
I can spy.
Awesome. So basically, I suppose the first question is, what is the QGIS Graphical Modeler? And it's a visual programming tool, essentially, for designing workflows and processing pipelines, I suppose you could say. It's easiest to just kind of see what it does. It's quite simple in its operation. It's straightforward. But it is also a bit nuanced. So I'm going to try and just go through a whole bunch of the kind of quirks and issues that people tend to stumble into when it comes to the modeler, so that everybody can get up to speed quickly. Basically, if you're familiar with other no-code or low-code IDEs, so the astute amongst you might have seen it. I put those buzzwords in when I wrote the the session description, but in my defense, it was early hours in the morning, and I thought buzzwords were cool. But it's a misnomer. It's not a low-code or no-code tool. I know those are buzzwords that people use for programming environments, but they are specific to programming environments. It's like an IDE that you get a no-code platform or IDE for producing software. So the model builder is for building models, which are kind of like data processing workflows. So you do kind of need a couple of prerequisites in order to start using the modeler and leveraging it effectively. The first thing is to be familiar with QGIS processing. If you are unfamiliar with any form of spatial analysis or how to use the processing tools within QGIS, you're probably going to have a bit of a tough time using the graphical modeler itself. So it really it's kind of imperative that you understand the processing toolbox. If you want to access the processing toolbox from the QGIS interface, there's the keyboard shortcuts of Control-Alt-T. There's the shortcut on the main toolbar, and under the processing menu, there's also the toolbox section, and that lists all the available processing tools that are available in QGIS. The ones with the little QGIS logo are native processing algorithms, so they're tightly integrated with the QGIS code base. But QGIS also kind of serves as this nice front end and processing environment, which leverages a lot of other open source projects and libraries. So you can see GUDAL tools. If your system has grass available on the path, QGIS will automatically try and bring it into this processing toolbox. It's not a separate plugin anymore like it was historically. Saga as well, same story. I think there was a bit of confusion with the latest release of 320, which I'm using here. So like if your interface with the LTR isn't exactly the same as mine, it's probably because I'm using the latest release of QGIS 320. And with the OSGeo installer, there were a bunch of changes. Just to get everyone up to speed on that, I suppose, in the first place. It used to be OSGeo 4W64, I think, was the default directory for 64-bit systems, but I think 32-bit has been dropped, or support for 32-bit has been dropped now. There's also a new installer for a better experience for installing your OSGeo software with the Windows installer. So I would download the new installer. I think it's the default on the QGIS.org website anyway. But a lot of people were struggling because, well, I saw on the forums a lot of people were struggling because the GRASS tools, it used to be a separate executable that you would, or a batch file that you would like run separately. So you would launch QGIS with GRASS, but it's all integrated into one kind of installer now. So like GRASS will automatically be available if it's installed on the system. And in your processing toolbox, you have access to your custom models and your custom scripts, etc. So this is kind of a directory or an interface for you to access all those tools that you design for yourself, because being open source, QGIS is very flexible. And these models are what we're going to be talking about today, which is the graphical modeler models. So the graphical modeler itself, you can access from the processing toolbox. You can create a new model. You can open an existing model from a file on your file system. You can add a model to the toolbox, so that will kind of register the model in place, like in your downloads folder or whatever, so that you can access it from the processing toolbox, and you can access it from the processing menu as well, or using the keyboard shortcut. So if we fire up the graphical modeler, you'll see that it comes up with the model designer interface. And this works much the same as the rest of QGIS. This is the kind of the default layouts, where you've got a couple tabs, where you've got model inputs and algorithms. You've got your model properties panel, your model variables panel, and your undo history. So this works much the same as the rest of QGIS. As I said, you can pop out your panels, and you can try and, if I can get it to work, would make me embarrassed. You can drag and drop it around the interface to get it into a design that you are comfortable with. Basically, the undo history keeps track of everything that you do within the model, so that you can easily kind of revert your changes and work more effectively with it. There's also a bunch of navigation tools. So in the model menu, you can see that you can validate the model. That's like, will it run without errors? You can perform some of the actions, such as reorder model inputs. So that function is also available down here as a button, but it's available from the model menu. And then there's just kind of the standard navigation and export controls. There's a couple of configuration options under the edit menu and view menu. So you can cut, copy, and paste objects from models. You can even copy objects from one model to another model and paste them in, kind of like you can with the layers in QGIS projects. Most of the entities, with some exceptions, work quite well where you can just copy, paste, and move them around. There's the select all and snap selected components to grid, which is just for like a visual design option, and the add group box, which we'll get to a bit later. And then there's the view and navigation controls. I think by default, this enable snapping option is turned off, which is basically every time you put an entity into the model, it's going to try and like align it and snap it to like a neat grid, just to keep things more organized. So pretty straightforward. I mean, I don't think there's anything here that's very confusing. These are your save options. you can open an existing model, you can save the current model, you can save it as a new file on the file system, and you can save models in the project. So we'll get into those saving options a bit later. There's also the pan, select, undo, redo, zoom in, zoom out, and zoom full extent, kind of like your map canvas navigation. So if you're familiar with standard map navigation in QGIS, shouldn't be too complicated. If you're familiar with the export options in the layout manager, then these kind of export to image options will be pretty familiar to you as well. So you can take a model and you can export it to a Python script, which we'll also detail a bit more later. And you can export into various different document formats, including PDF, scalable vector graphics, and images. And we'll go over why that's useful and important later. And there's also a help section. So this edit model help button will be very, very useful to you and your users, because you can go through each of the objects within your model and you can give it a description, so that when people run your model and they go through each of the input items, you can describe exactly what is going on. So basically, to show everybody what it's all about, we can just build a very simple model quickly. Firstly, we need to give our model a name. So I'm going to call this buffer operation. And we want to give it a group. And the group is important because, as you can see in QGIS, within the processing toolbox, I have my models all kind of grouped together for the sake of organization. The search button does still function, or the search feature within the processing toolbox does still function on your model names and your model groups, which is quite useful. But I think when you're designing your own tools, keeping your own kind of like well-managed hierarchy for grouping your objects is quite important. So we can add this. I've already got a custom models group, so I'm going to add my new model to that existing group, and I'll just do that by using the same group name of custom models. So you can find this model properties window. I suppose if you don't know what you're looking for, it might like be hidden behind the variables window, and it's kind of important because you'll find it difficult to save and use your models without setting those parameters. All right. The first thing we need to define for running a model is going to be some sort of input. So when you run a processing tool from QGIS, for example, if I just create a simple point feature, get my points layer. For the sake of these demonstrations, I'm just going to be using WebMercator. Obviously, if you're doing spatial analysis, you really aren't going to be using this coordinate reference system. If you are, please contact us and we can help train you as to why that's a bad idea. But don't attack me for using it's just to get meters. It's really not. It's for demonstration purposes. So none of the analysis performed today is going to be like scientifically valid. It's just for demo purposes. So please don't judge my analytical ability based on what you see here today, please. Anyway, so basically, if we create a point, make it not such a horrible dot. There we go. So I live here in KZN, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, which is why you can kind of see that that's where we are on the map of the world. I don't quite live in the center of it, but I'm going to just place a point there, and then I'm going to perform a buffer operation. So if you're not familiar with existing QGIS tools for some reason, basically just when you run a processing tool, it comes up with this processing tool interface, and this is the help section that I described earlier in the model builder. Each of the processing tools that are available in QGIS already have help information and information on the tool, what it does, Some of them have further details on the specific inputs, what the requirements, etc. are, and so on and so forth.
Can I interrupt you with a quick question about the help text?
Yes.
Awesome. So Hans van der Kost asks, does the help text editor use Markdown, HTML, or something else? For example, how do you add the URLs in the help text editor?
I've only actually used it for plain text, so I suppose it's worth experimenting with. There are sections of QGIS where it allows like expressions and stuff. As far as I'm aware, if I go to my model builder and my help text, each of these objects is just kind of plain text. I don't think if I had to add like another heading, I don't think that anything's really gonna. There's no like markdown passing happening. I mean, I could try with HTML, but I'm pretty sure it's just kind of standard plain text. The headers themselves are kind of determined based on what the sections are, the relevant sections are. So there's the general description, there's the input parameter descriptions, and the output parameter descriptions, which you see here. So if I go into the outputs, you can see that I've got some. Oh no, it looks like it actually has put some. It passed the HTML there. So I learned something new. Thanks, Hans. So yeah, it looks like you can
live on TV.
Yeah,
we have learned
some content. So you can actually add rich content, but apparently Markdown is not really what people are keen on. So there we go. I imagine most HTML is supported. I'm not entirely sure which tags are going to be excluded or included in that. But yeah, you can use HTML apparently.
All right, and there's a comment from Joao that says yes, you can. So thank you so much, Charlie. You can segue back to what you were doing.
Great. So in your processing tool, we've got the help info, which can be collapsed, so you get a more kind of concise interface, and then you've got each of your objects, your input objects for defining the parameters of the processing tool. Here we can just give it like a distance of 1.5 km or maybe 2,000 kilometers. 5,000. Be able to actually see it, and then we can save the output to various files or just create temporary layers. So I'm assuming most of the audience is familiar with these kind of processing tools. There's also, importantly, these iterate over this layer, which it iterates over each feature within the layer sequentially, each record in the input table. So you can check that on and off. So a lot of times people have issues with kind of, for loops or iterating over specific items. And we'll get a bit more into the challenges and complexities with that later. There's also this advanced option for feature validity checking. So this is something that you can set in your user settings. You can set your default to check whether the input geometries are valid or not, or skip them, etc. And this it's not, I suppose, like super critical, but it can trip people up when they've got like dirty input data, or you're going from one tool to another and it produces some kind of invalid output. And you need to be aware of how to set these options if you encounter challenges. So if we just run the tool, so just use the run option, you can see that processing tools use this processing log, and it gives you some information. It tells you what the input parameters are. And once it executes, it automatically adds this this output feature that I've created, the temporary layer, to my my QGIS project. So if we zoom in there, you'll see that there's a buffered layer. One other, I suppose, tip is that if I have to remove this tool, You can see that when I run the processing tool, it automatically, QGIS, when it loads the new layer, it's automatically going to try and determine what the active layer is. So you can see my active layer there was the points layer, and it added the buffered features on top of it. If I wanted those buffered features to automatically be added and rendered underneath those points, I can select the layer underneath that in the table of contents, run the buffer tool. This was 5,000 or whatever. And just make sure I select my right input layer, and when I run it, it should be added on top of the active layer, but underneath the layer that I wanted to be rendered on top of it. So that's a pro tip. But lost my train of thought now. So that's the basics of running a processing tool. QGIS also has this processing history and processing logs, so you can go to these messages right down in the bottom right. You can have a look at the processing log, see what has been run, if there's any feedback or errors, especially when you're running like custom Python algorithms, you can get them from the log messages. And there's also this processing history tool, which is quite handy. Lets you know exactly how things have been run. And you can actually copy this code to execute the same tool over again. So like this is from the Python console. And if I had to bring up the Python console, I could run this same tool that I've just run, that same buffer, with the same parameters, and it should automatically just run. It won't add it to the map though. The reason for that is that the Python processing run algorithm is not run and load. That's a separate command. Get to it. I think it's run and load or something. Run and load. That. I'll have to double check what it is. But it is a separate command to run and load it into the current project. Right, so it's not that the processing tool didn't run, it's just that it didn't load the output into the project, but because it's a temporary layer, I'm not really worried about it. So these same operations can be performed in a graphical modeling tool. The parameters that are specified for the tool can either be set as inputs from the user, or they can be defined. So one of the really useful features of or functions of the graphical modeler is the ability to either chain multiple processes together for automation purposes, but it's also very useful for designing tools for application-specific purposes. So the processing models that are available in QGIS, they're pretty generic, and they come with kind of sensible defaults for any situation, but not all situations. So when you're designing like a process for a very application-specific purpose, you might find that your details or the parameters that are used are better served to be like more strictly defined, or it should have different default values. So the first thing we do is we define some inputs. So for the buffer tool, we know that we need a vector layer, and you can enforce like strict geometry type checks. So we can say, don't accept unless it is a point layer or something like that. So if you're like designing tools for an organization and you've got like very strict procedures in place, you can have the geometry type specified, or just say that any geometry. So here, I know that if I'm going to try a buffer features in the table that don't have geometry, then it's going to cause an issue. So I know that I need geometry, so I can just say any geometry type, but the buffer tool should work even if it's an area or line feature. So we can specify the input, and that will come up as a feature at the input layer. So when we run the model, it will prompt us for that input. But then we can also have a query for, say, the distance of the buffer. So there are distance tools. You kind of need to be familiar when you're designing models with the concept of different data types. So at the very least, kind of like string and text in data types, numbers and decimals and integers. If you work with geodata and attribute tables and so on and so forth, it shouldn't be too complicated, and you should kind of have a firm grasp of that already. If you come from a programming background as well, you should be familiar with all those concepts. The processing tool, I suppose, you do need to have a bit of a better understanding of the data types that are supported by QGIS itself. So, for example, if you wanted a user to define a CRS, because you're building a model that reprojects layers, you could have a CRS input types, because if you were trying to, get text input and, try and cast it and define your CRS by some user input text or something, there's a high probability that you could result in error. So you can utilize the existing tools for defining parameters that QGIS provides by using all these different data types. In this instance, for buffer, we can just use a standard number, and we can define whether or not it's a float. So that's like a decimal number with a floating point, or floating decimal, or a whole number or integer. So in this case, I really just want it to be an integer. I'm not really concerned about a float. And I can call it parameter buffer distance. And we can set it to integer. Minimum value has to be greater than 1,000, and maximum value will be 10,000, and the default value will be 5,000. And what will happen is that QGIS, with that input form, or the model parameter form, when you try and run the model, it's going to perform validation on these inputs, and it will prompt the user and say, you can't submit if you've gone over the maximum or the minimum, etc. So it does that all automatically. You don't have to set your own kind of form validation. It'll do that for you, which is pretty handy. And then once we've got our inputs defined, we need to define what processes we're going to perform. So we need to do some buffering. So much like the processing toolbox, we've got all the algorithms available. It's just in a separate tab. And you can use a search function or dig through all the different tools that are available. As you can see, most of the native tools are available by default. I think in the older versions of QGIS, I'm not sure exactly which versions, not all of the algorithms were just available. It was a much more limited set, and also getting external applications to interface with the model builder was a bit more challenging. In the more recent versions of QGIS, there's a lot more tools available. There's also model-specific tools. So you can see here that these are tools that are not available in the standard processing toolbox. They're especially designed to be used within the model builder. Another thing is that not all of the processing tools that are available in QGIS, even in the later versions, are going to be available. And that's just kind of by their design. And so there's a couple of semantics as to which algorithms are actually eligible for inclusion in the model builder. I think one requirement that I'm aware of is if a processing tool outputs an unknown number of output layers, you can't really use it in the processing in the model builder, because it gives you kind of an unexpected output. The model won't know what to do with all of them. So there are a couple of prerequisites or semantics that are limit which processing tools will be available, and that's unlikely to change. You can also perform certain functions like accessing layouts, so you can build models that automate the exporting of atlases, so you can do some processing, defining of regions or graticules, and then export them. So you have access to the full kind of QGIS API, essentially. It's not just limited to map functions or data processing functions. You can also access things like layouts, etc. Right. So once we start defining the parameters for one of our processing tools, you can see that there's a number of different data types. So when the model automatically is trying to pull in some information, and this context comes from the project itself. So this model is expecting to be stored and managed within the project, and it's expecting to find a layer that is available within the project itself. Most of the time, we're not going to be defining project-specific models in that sense. We'll be designing more generic and reusable models. So we don't really want to use one of these input layers that are available in the current project. We want to use a model input. And the model input needs to kind of match, the input type needs to match the parameter type for this processing tool. So you can see that I can't use the number or buffer distance as a buffering feature. So QGIS automatically limits me there on what I can and cannot achieve or utilize. I can, however, use the model input for the buffer distance, and then that will automatically set everything up for me. And one of the great things with the model builder is that the rest of these parameters will kind of be hidden from the end user. So if you, for example, are setting up like a database connection for users, and you build a model for your database, your enterprise database, to ingest data, you can, force the export to Postgres processing tool to automatically reproject the data, so that all of the data that is getting imported, gets reprojected. And that will be hidden from the end user. So people who are not necessarily GIS people or don't understand coordinate reference systems don't really have to worry about their data validity when they are performing those kind of ingestion operations and so on. Right. So this will perform the buffer operation for us, but you can see that even if I save this model, so I'm going to save it in the project, and we'll get a bit more into what saving into the projects, etc., does for you. One thing to note is that now that I've saved the project into the model into the project, this project has not been saved. So if I had to close this project and then open it again without saving, that project, that model would no longer be available. So it's very important that when you save your models into your project, that you save your project afterwards. Right. So you can see there's a new section within my processing toolbox now, and that is for my project-specific models. So I've got my custom models here. You can see it's separate from my standard models. And if I double-click this, it will come up and it asks me for the buffer distance, and it asks me for the layer that I want to perform the buffer on. When I press run, it happens very quickly, but it does execute. And again, you can see that it's executed. I should probably remove this to remove confusion. It's executed, but nothing has happened. And the reason for that is that I haven't specified an output. So if I go back to this model, and I can edit an existing model from this toolbox section by just going edit, and I can specify this as an output. So the same way that I showed you how to run a processing log and it didn't load my outputs, I need to specify the output within the tool. So once I've specified my outputs and I save it, you'll see that that output will automatically, the tool will prompt me for the output, and I can obviously save it to file or disk, but because I'm making a temporary layer, it's going to automatically open the file for me once I run it. So now it's added to my map. So hopefully that makes sense and it's not too confusing. Right. Lost my train of thought again.
Can I interrupt you with a few questions? I don't want it too often because we're already halfway. So, but there are two questions just in the live chat. So Matthew asks, how do we iterate an intermediate parameter within the model?
I don't know that you can. It depends on the tool, the input tool. So you'll see from my buffer operation here, even if I make this a layer from my map, you can see that that iterate over each feature is no longer available. So I don't actually know. I try and have a look and dig through some of the tools to find ones that do support iterate, but that varies from tool to tool. So it's not very easy to do using just the stock standard tools. But we'll get into conditionals and iterations in a bit.
Alrighty, and then there's one more question from Jigme. And is it possible to iterate multiple files in a folder as an input to the modeler?
I haven't actually tested a folder. You can do, I know for a fact that you can do multiple files. So I'll show an example of that in a second. There is this multiple input parameter. And I think there is there a directory? No, I don't think there's a directory for that. So yeah, there's a multiple input specification. So you can, I think you can have files, but you can't have directories. But you can, I think you can specify multiple files. I think you would probably run a custom script to do that, though. I mean, I don't think it would be too hard to integrate, depending on what you want to do. But I'm not aware of a way to do it with the directory in the model builder as such. One thing to note is that once you've stored your models, the same tools that are available within your processing toolbox, they're available within the graphical modeler. So, if I've got these custom scripts, for example, I've got some demo algorithms here, this returns true, etc. I can actually add them into my modeler and use them in my workflow and process. So you can definitely just use QGIS, etc., to automatically just do whatever it is that any functionality that is kind of missing, you can integrate that way with custom scripts. And then again, any of your models that are available on the system are also available within the modeler, so you can open and store them, etc. Right, so
Alrighty,
you can.
that's great. I'm just going to say that, for anyone who wants more information or really wanted to sink their teeth into the nitty gritty of it, please, pop a message on the Telegram group, and multiple brains are better than one. So definitely, pop it and we can discuss it further on the group. And I would just like Charlie to continue with the video as time dictates.
Yeah, so where models are stored, where these models that are available within my processing toolbox is in the user profile directory. So if you go to settings, user profiles, and open the active profile folder, you'll find that there, here's the profile folder, and you'll see that there's a processing directory, and inside there you find your models. So these are the models I have available. They are simple text files, they are XML. More, I suppose, complex XML schema, but that's why they are able to be stored within projects, within the XML, within a QGIS project, and within the QGZ. So they are simple text files. You can access them. You can import other models as well from various resources. So, for example, the plugins.qgis.org has now got the hub available. So there's a styles directory where you can download styles and import them with the style manager. So you can use community source styles to perform advanced symbology, etc. And along with that, there are projects and there are models. So there's a projects directory for geopackages and a models directory where you can download models directly. So there's a bunch of models here available, and these are great because you can leverage the kind of expertise of experts. So if you're learning on the fly, like I've often had to do. So for example, Hans is quite organized and very good at designing hydrology processing models, and you can actually learn a lot of the theory just by introspecting those models when you use them, which is great. I've downloaded a bunch of these I don't know who V is, but thank you for your contributions. But these simple models, and you can just click and download them. You can also upload your own models so that other people can utilize them to this hub. I think you need an Osteo ID, and the download will come in zip format, so you can unzip it. And I've got a couple of these here that I can demonstrate for you. So once you go into the file, you'll see that there's a license associated with it, and there's the model file, which is that XML that I described earlier. And if I were to copy this, so if I take, I'll start from the top here, non-overlapping buffers from points. I'm going to copy that, go to my user profile directory, paste it in there, and then this won't automatically become available. I need to refresh it. But there's no refresh option, so I'll just save an existing model, and it should be, you can see that the data prep is now available. So that's how you manually get a model from someone else into your system. It's by adding it to this models directory within your user profile. If you change your user profile, so if I go settings, user profile, and select user profile 2, you'll find that it's not there. It's very specific to that particular profile. You can also open an existing model. So I can open an existing model, go to my downloads folder, go to the second one, open that model, and then I can go save as, and you can see it's automatically gone to my user profile data, and then I can give it whatever name I want. As long as it's unique, it won't conflict with anything else. And this gibberish that I'm adding in as the file name is irrelevant because the description is coming from this group and this name within the model properties. So I think it should be there somewhere. Not sure why it's not showing up. Oh, there we go. Just had to refresh. So that's how you can add things that way. You can also add a model to the toolbox. So if I go to my downloads folder, I can add it that way. And you should see that it's added to my toolbox now, but I haven't had to put that in my user directory. QGIS is intelligently looking for that particular model from my downloads directory. So that's how you load up models from other users. And then there is also something called the resource sharing plugin. If you go manage and install plugins, it's not a core plugin, I think. So you have to look for resource sharing. It's this little sharing icon, and that's this plugin here. And that's typically what we use to distribute. It's kind of like the best method of distributing various objects. So if you go add a repository, you can add your custom repository. For example, I have one with these models that I'm demonstrating today. It's available here. So you just take this GitHub directory. I'll paste it in the chat if you want to share it. And then you can just add .git to the end, and then you can give it a name, and then I've already added it here. You can see. So you can see that's my Git repository, and then it will pull the resources and models in from there. Once you've got the resource sharing repository set up, you'll see that it takes authentication if you've got a private Git repo, so you don't want to share your resources with everyone in an organization or something. I think there was an issue with like GitHub authentication and public key infrastructure. I don't know if it's been fixed because there were API changes in QGIS. I don't know if they were patched. But you can also add a repository and just use, you can just git clone to your local device, and then like I can just add file p. It's got a bit of a strange syntax, but data in my repository.git, and then I can add it that way. Instead, you can just use this file parameter instead of using the web resource. So you can add resources like that as well. But once you've added your repository itself, you haven't got the collection of stuff in your, or the collection of resources within your QGIS automatically. You need to actually search for it and add and download it. And you can see there's this uninstall, reinstall, or if you haven't installed it yet, you will run the installer, and that will download all of the resources from this repository and add it to your user profile directly. So any models that I have in the resource sharing plugin repository will be available automatically. And if you want to have a look at what that looks like, that's where I got all of these models from. Those are all part of that resource directory that I've shared the link for. And you can actually, this map project is also coming from the resource sharing plugin. So if you go into your profile, resource sharing repositories, and I go to my repository directory, you can see that I've even got the map files and the SHPs to show off some, or to access this base map project. So if I reload this project, you'll see that project is coming from there. Right, so you can see now that I've reloaded the project, which was not saved. I haven't got my my project models available anymore. One of the great things with the graphical modeler is you can store the project, you can store the model in the project, and then you can save the project. You can save to GeoPackage. So you can save the project itself in a database, either GeoPackage or Postgres, and you can save the models within that project as well. So when I'm distributing projects and files to people, typically what I'll do is I'll just supply them with a single GeoPackage, and it has the QGIS project and it has the models inside as well. So yeah, that's kind of the surrounding ecosystem. You can also find a lot of people, the QGIS hub is relatively new. It hasn't been around for an awfully long time, and there are a lot of resources online. So if you go, for example, to like I think Ujval's got some models on his GitHub account. So if you go to like Spatial Thoughts QGIS resource sharing, you'll probably find that there's a bunch of models in there as well. So if you dig around the internet, there are some community resources, but you just need to know how to load those Model 3 files in order to use them. Right. So especially if you're asking for help and someone shares a model with you, you need to be able to load it, which is why I demonstrated those options. Right. So hopefully that's straightforward and everyone's familiar with how to load up the models now, and they're familiar with what they are. And then we can dig into some of the more complicated kind of aspects of them. So if I run a model, you can go through multiple input layers, as I demonstrated earlier. But again, when I was asked about the file directory, but you can't just use it for any tool. So for example, I have this input layers input for a model, and you need to, that's a multiple input type. So if I run this model, you'll see that it asks me which input layers I want to use, and I can select a bunch of them, and it runs a buffer on them. But if I want to run a buffer tool, so if I add a new buffer, you'll see that the inputs it won't support that input because it's not the right input type. So if you're taking in multiple inputs, you need to use a tool that supports it. Like here, I can use the merge vector layers, and I can use all of those input layers, merge them into one layer, and then perform some function on it. So you can't really just iterate over them. Another kind of complicated aspect that people get tripped up on when setting up models is the dependency management. So as I showed earlier, if you haven't specified an output, nothing's going to come of your input. So you need to, when you define your model, QGIS is going to try and run everything at the same time. So before your one step moves into the next step, you need to manually define the dependency. The model builder itself does not automatically determine that because one feature is like a derived output and then it's used as an input in another tool, it doesn't infer that it's a dependency like automatically. You actually have to manually specify that. You can also deactivate certain aspects of your workflow. So if you have multiple processes running together, you can deactivate them so that you don't lose your work in the model. But if you reactivate it, you'll see that everything down the chain does not automatically activate. There's also, sorry, I'm just rushing through everything because we're running completely out of time. There's also this add group. So you can add groups to things. This is more for visual displays purposes. So if you want to export a model as an image or a PDF output, etc., for reports, so people can introspect your workflow and your processing technique and make sure that everything is up to scratch, because it really is a very powerful tool for people to kind of review exactly what is happening. When you're reviewing code, you don't really get these kind of high level like workflow and process designs, which is why things like unified modeling language and stuff exist, where people can describe the way systems work. And this kind of this works as a processing tool, but it also provides that kind of like a high-level overview. So it's very useful for reporting. And sometimes you just want to use a group to like highlight which aspects a feature is a part of. In addition to the help information, you also have this comment section. So if you take any elements within your model and you just right click it, it's got this comment section. I think this will also probably support your HTML more than likely. And you can add comments and suggestions. Just to highlight, this is not going to be shown to the end user, so it's not part of the help. But for anyone who is making changes, it's like comments in code. It's just letting people know. So apparently it doesn't render automatically. It renders when you hover over it, which is interesting. But basically, it's just for people who are, editing along with you. They're modifying your models. Or if you come back to a model in 6 months, you need to know some kind of interesting aspect of it. So comments are very useful. There is also another thing that I want to talk about, which is, context. I think a lot of people, when they start working with QGIS APIs and stuff, like I say, QGIS doesn't often infer things for you automatically. Not everything's in a wrapper. It also doesn't automatically try and determine, what context things are being run in. So QGIS is used as a lot of the code and API and methods are used in QGIS Server. They're used in other mobile applications and not just QGIS Desktop. They're sometimes run from the command line. So, for example, you can run models from the command line the same way that you can run native algorithms. I was going to get a bit more into that, but I don't think there's time. But
we'll just have another session next month.
Yeah, apparently. Completely ran out of time on this one. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, QGIS doesn't automatically infer context a lot of the time. Sometimes you instantiate an object and it doesn't like automatically just determine what it's supposed to be, and you sometimes have to tell it. And I think the same is true to an extent with models. So for example, if you are using, if I go into my options, my settings, my user settings, I can set variables. So if I can find the actual option, I'm sure there was an option in there somewhere. There we go, variables. So I can add in a variable saying my name, and I can call myself Magical Yeti Man. And that is that's a variable that is tied to my current user profile's context. So if I change user profile, this my name variable is not going to exist anymore. Projects have their own context as well with regards to variables. So you need to define your variables in there. If I can open this, that would be great. So I can say, your name. Right, so I can have these different variables defined in my project context. I can have it defined in my user context. And then models have their own context as well. So if you are editing something in a model, it's not going to automatically have access to those variables. So if I go into defining something with an expression, And QGIS expressions is really going to, like, learning QGIS expressions and leveraging them effectively. It's really going to make your like model building a lot easier. I don't know how you would do it without leveraging QGIS expressions very well. But you can see that the my name and your name variables, the project variables, are not necessarily just available in the top of the context. So these are the variables available from the model context itself, and that's from all of the objects. But you'd have to go down into the expression builder and find the other models, the other variables available there. Part of the challenge there is going to be, like, when you run your model, you need to know that context is set properly and that variable is available. Another issue is that if I copy and paste an object, so I can copy and paste my multiple outputs, etc. But if I don't change the name of these objects, when it comes to defining it in an expression, you'll find that they have the same name. And you won't be able to identify or differentiate between them. So you've always got to go back and make sure that they have unique names. You can just change it up there. That will change things for you. Again, I think dependency management is probably the most critical thing to understand when it comes to running models. So, for example, if I open this model and I show you what's going on here, basically I'm taking inputs and I'm just generating centroids along, the line. I'm just projecting them down the line, and I'm performing buffers on them. But you can see that it's taking the same input layer and it's generating those geometries and performing buffers. And QGIS is going to automatically try and do this as performantly as possible. So it's going to try and do all of it at once. So remember that a lot of processing algorithms are kind of single-threaded or thread-safe. And when you use models, they can be leveraged very effectively for performance improvements, because anything that is not parallel, QGIS is going to try and set up another process to run it automatically. Whereas if you've got things in sequence and they're depending on each other, that you need to define that it has to wait for something else in order to continue. But if you try and utilize something as an input without specifying as a dependency, you're going to be trying to run an operation on, say, a layer or a function that isn't available yet, which will result in a null output or something breaking. Right. So, for example, if I run a I'll just make a point quickly. And I run a buffer operation on my point. You can see that it's done the parallel buffer, and if I go into the log, it took about 1 second. And if I do the sequential buffer, which is does a buffer, waits for the dependency, does another buffer. So I can just put that in a group and hide it. So the time difference should be substantial. Yeah, so it went from 1 second to 2.8 seconds. So that's, QGIS is trying to run things in parallel, and you need to manually specify those dependencies to prevent race conditions. And I think that's pretty much the most critical aspect of the model builder. I think dependencies trip people up a lot. I really did not expect this hour to go that quickly at all. And there was probably a whole nother hour's worth of discussing this. So I apologize. But if you would like to, you can just download the resource sharing plugin. You can just dive into the resources that are made available in this repository. And I've made a bunch of different models that perform different actions. So ones that use conditions. So that's probably something else worth mentioning that's important, is that the conditional branches, I don't know which one uses conditions actually, but the conditional branches in the model builder, this condition, where is it? It's under modeler tools. This conditional branch, you will define a condition for a branch to exist. And that condition, when you define that branch, is actually defined in your dependencies. It's not defined by another input, or doesn't like make a branch in another way. It's defined by setting up your dependency. So you'll go and you'll find the conditional branch in your dependency, and then you'll have that additional workflow coming out there. Right. Hopefully that makes sense.
I'm sure it did. It was great. Quite quick, and I think I will see if I can twist your arm to perhaps next month give us another, Modeler 2.0 session, which would be absolutely amazing. And thank you. This was really great. I think it's very nice to see all of the resources that we can pull from and learn from in the QGIS community. So thank you for showing us that and just giving us the basic, outline, how everything fits together, and those really great tips and tricks. For people who are new to Model Builder, it's great to know, the pitfalls so that we can avoid them. So thank you so much, Charlie, for giving us that great talk. We do not have any more questions in the chat, so we will then be going over to our next session. I am just waiting on the speaker to join us, so I'm going to then just ask Charlie one more question that was asked at the very beginning, but it should be relatively easy to explain. So Prana asks, what's the difference between GRASS tools and the rest of the tools in the geoprocessing toolbox?
Well, GRASS is a separate third-party GIS system. It's different code base and context to QGIS. Same with Saga. Actually, it's actually a distinct GIS system. So GDAL is like it's the geodata abstraction library. So that's used for processing and changing formats, etc. And it comes with some geoprocessing tools which QGIS leverages. But GDAL is actually baked into QGIS as part of the import of different features. GRASS is completely distinct, and they have different functions. So if you're doing things like hydrology and climatology and that sort of thing, like Saga's got probably more advanced tools than QGIS, which are like generally more generic. GRASS also has some advanced like vector operations. I think GRASS's cleaning tools are quite extensive. But basically, the QGIS developers and the GRASS developers have kind of built these APIs that talk to each other. So they've got different software systems that are talking to each other in order to leverage each other's processing tools, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks so much, Charlie, for your great insight. And I am then going to sign us off. Please do join us for the next session. We may start a little bit later than the original time, but that's all right. So thank you for everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Charlie, for giving us such a great presentation. And I will see you all in the next session.